When people are talking about SharePoint sites or any other website, there are different ways in which they use the word permission. For example, if I say, I have permission to log on to a network or log on to a site or a server, it's not really permission that I'm talking about. It's something more specific that's actually called authentication. Authentication is the question of how does the server know I'm who I say I am so that I can be given appropriate access. And authentication happens because I have a username and a password, which is why I need to guard those things so no one else can impersonate me. But the access that I get after I've been authenticated, once Windows or some other system tells the server, hey, she's exactly who she says she is, the permission that I have after that is permission, and it's called site permissions. In this movie, I'm going to talk to you about how you can think about and plan permissions for your SharePoint site, and then in the next couple of movies, we'll see how you will set permissions. I'll tell you first that this is an area where many SharePoint administrators wish they'd known more when they started, and that they'd had a better framework for thinking about permissions. So my job here is to provide you with a way to think about this. There are two things that you need to balance. First, you want to make sure that users only have access to the information that they need to do their jobs. And the second is, you want to make sure that you can actually administer the server and administer those levels of permissions. So at one end of the spectrum, I could actually set individual permissions for every single document on my site. And so if you worked in payroll, I'd say, well, you get to use these 5 payroll files in the SharePoint library. There are hundreds of files in there, but I'll give you permission to just these 5. If I did that for every user, I would never have time to keep those permissions up to date. At the opposite end of the spectrum is to give everybody permission to everything, and that's probably wrong too. So someplace in the middle, I need to find the place in the spectrum where I can balance folks' need to access documents and my need to make sure that the site's administered by me or by somebody else. Now, you may not be setting site permissions, but it's helpful, even if you're not, for you to understand them so that when you ask for permissions, you know what you're asking for. If managing permissions is difficult or impossible, sooner or later, somebody will have permission to something that they shouldn't have had permission to see, simply because it's too hard for us to do the work of administration that we'd laid out. When you start working with permissions for your site, I'd like you to begin by relying on the standard permissions groups that are already built into every single SharePoint site. You might want to give them different names. Don't. Just go with what's here because it's going to make your job easier. You won't need to translate every time you pick up a piece of documentation. The first group is a group that's called members. Members can contribute to a site, but they can't change the structure of the site. And many of the people on any site you have will be members, except perhaps for sites that are used for reference. But a collaboration site, we're probably all members. Members are allowed to edit documents, to add documents to a library. They can delete documents that they posted, but they can't add columns to the library. Members have the ability to contribute, but not to change the structure. The next group is the visitors group, and these are folks who can only read the documents that are there. Sometimes distinguishing between these two groups clearly will get you a long way in setting permissions that you can administer, because there are often many people who should be allowed to read documents. We just don't give them permission. We say, well, if so-and-so needs that document, they can ask for it. But really, if there's no reason that they shouldn't see it, it's easier simply to make them visitors. It's easier because we won't be in a position where we'll have to send them documents by email anymore. And it's easier because it keeps a paradigm that says that there are people who can come to a site and see documents, but they won't be editing them. It's interesting and perhaps even ironic in a way that in many of the sites that I work with, the visitors aren't people who visit the organization. They're the leaders of the organization. They need to read the work that their teams are doing, but they don't need to edit it themselves. And then finally, you have the third group on every site, which is owners. Owners can change site settings. Owners can change permissions. You want to have a small number of people in your owners group. Ideally, for any site, you want to have no more than 3 and probably just 2 owners. 1 isn't enough. If that person goes on vacation, there are things that might need to be done to the site that nobody will be able to do. And if it's 2, choose 2 people who don't routinely vacation together. But if you have too many people, it's harder to keep track of what's being done. And more importantly, if you have 7 or 8 site administrators, most of them won't do it often enough to do it well. Each time will be a new adventure in trying to get something done. But owners are the people who can change the settings. They can change the look and feel of the site. They can do many of the things that you and I have been doing on SharePoint sites in this course. They can delete lists and libraries and then empty the recycle bin behind them and everything's gone. So this is one or two or at most three trusted people. Another key concept when we think about permissions is inheritance. For example, we have our Land and Hotel intranet site that we have worked with. We've made a few changes to that site, and that site has a set of permissions. It has an owners group, it has a members group, and it has a visitors group. There are 2 owners in the owners group, and everyone who can log into the site is a visitor. Each of those 3 groups has unique permissions, and those are the out-of-the-box permissions. I didn't modify them at all. I'm simply going to add people to the groups that already exist. Then we have the Team Land and SF site. And it's possible for me to do one of 2 things. Either I can set unique, different permissions for Team Land and SF, or I can inherit the permissions that already exist on the Land and Hotel intranet site. When I created Team Land and SF, I inherited the permissions that are already there because it's the easiest thing to do when I'm starting. When we created Team Landon for New York City, we did the same thing. We inherited the permissions from the Land and Hotel intranet. This is the default setting, and that means that if I'm an owner on the Land and Hotel intranet and I bang out a couple more sites, I'll be an owner on those as well without doing anything else. If I have someone who I know is a visitor who can view but not edit documents on the Land and Hotel intranet, if I change nothing and inherit permissions, they can view the items on Team Landon for San Francisco and for New York City as well. And the same thing is true with members. If I can contribute on Land and Hotel intranet, I can contribute on the 2 sub-sites as well. We've also created a new site for the San Francisco events team, and I did it the same way. I inherited the permissions from Team Landon San Francisco, and if we were to create the site for the facilities team, we would do the same thing, at least initially. And then each of these sites have libraries. Each of these sites have lists. So the question is it really appropriate for me to inherit the permissions for all of these sites and for all of the lists and libraries within these sites? I need to be planful about it, because in my best world, what will happen is I will inherit permissions as much as I can. When I inherit, the bonus is I only have to manage permissions once. For example, it would be perfect in our world that everyone who had contributor access, owner access, or visitor access to any one of these sites had the same permissions on all of them. I would be foolish not to set the permissions at the highest level and inherit them. And there are 2 ways that this is spoken of, 2 ways that you'll see it being referred to. One is that Team Land and SF inherits from Land and Hotel intranet. The other way you'll sometimes see it described is that the permissions from the Land and Hotel intranet cascade through Team Landon San Francisco. When you're hearing the words inherit or cascade, it's the same notion from 2 different directions. So when you're planning your site permissions, it's really all about, can I inherit or can I not inherit? And if not, why not, and what permissions do I need? Because I actually do have a requirement for some different permissions, not just for my sites, but for lists and libraries. That's normally how it works. When we take a look at this site, the people who can contribute in New York City are going to be the employees that are in Manhattan, whereas the folks who will be able to contribute to Team Land and SF will be the folks who are in the Bernal Heights Hotel. It's not appropriate for someone sitting in San Francisco to be adding items to the documents that are sitting in Team Land in New York City. That's not how we're organized. So I will need to have non-inherited or unique permissions for contributors for Team Land in SF and Team Land in NYC, both, and the Team Land in Detroit set I already created. But once I've created those unique permissions for Team Land in SF, it's totally possible that I can inherit those permissions for the San Francisco events team, or perhaps for the San Francisco facilities team. One way that you can begin to plan permissions is to create a tool like this. You can use Excel and have a column for the name of the site, the description of the site, what level it's at, highest level being 1, what the parent site is. So the parent site for Team Land and SF is Land and Hotel Intranet. And then note, are you going to be able to inherit, or will the permissions be unique permissions? And then to spell out what those permissions are. This is at least a high-level way to think about how you would inherit permissions. This doesn't tell us who's going to be in each group or what specific permissions each of those groups will have, but it does begin to give us a handle on inheritance and permissions through our site. And if I wish, rather than simply listing the name of the sites in column A, I can copy and paste the URL. I'll have hyperlinks and I can go directly to the site to examine it. Makes this even a more useful tool. To be clear, inheritance is only from the site above. So a subsite can inherit from its parent site, but a subsite cannot inherit from its grandparent, for example. There's no way, for example, for the San Francisco events team site permissions to be inherited from the Land and Hotel Intranet site unless Team Land and SF inherited those permissions as well. I can only inherit permissions from my parent site. So what are our best practices for permissions and for thinking about this? Well, the first thing is to go back to that spreadsheet and start there. Create a spreadsheet and make sure that what we have is we have a column for each site and each individual app on the site that might need different permissions. And then line out, can I inherit permissions or do they need to be unique? But then I'd say that SharePoint administrators are agreed that the biggest mistake one can make is to be willing to assign permissions to individuals. You never want to assign permissions to individuals. You always want to create groups and assign permissions to groups. So the only individuals that may have permission to a site would be the person who's in charge of the entire set of site collections, the farm administrator, and perhaps the account for SharePoint itself. But other than that, you'll have groups. So if somebody says, no, this person needs unique permissions, they're not really a visitor and they're not really a contributor, they're somebody special, fine. Set up a group for special people and then put that person in the group, even if it's only one person. Create a group describing their permissions. Perhaps they're a site designer rather than a contributor. Create the appropriate permissions for that group and add the user to it, because later on, you'll have another user just like that one. We always want to set permissions at the highest level possible, at the level of a site collection rather than an individual site, if possible. If we need to set it at the site level, great. Set it at the site level and avoid setting it in lists or libraries. But if you have to, go ahead, because that's better than individual documents. You can set permissions for individual documents, but you don't want to do this for the same reason that you don't want to set permissions for individuals. If you have an individual document that has special permissions that are needed, only 4 people can get to it. Put it in a library all by itself and set permissions for that library. Because as soon as you've set permissions for one document, you'll get requests to set permissions for documents that are similar. You might as well do the work ahead of time. And if you know that nowhere in your site do you have permissions set at a lower level than a list or library, you're going to be a lot better off. Whenever possible, we want to use broadly based high-level groups. So that goes along with setting permissions at the highest level possible. When someone says, I want to make sure that these folks don't have access because there's no reason for them to, I'm always going to ask the question, is there harm in allowing them to see it? Is there harm in allowing the employees who've been around for a while to see what's in the new employee site? If there is, different permissions. If there's not, then it's better if we have the same permissions for everything within that Help Yourself site. If you follow these best practices, you're going to find it's much easier to be able to plan and administer your permissions for your SharePoint site. So go ahead, fire up Excel, and start thinking about how you need to grant people the ability to visit, contribute to, or own your sites, your lists, your libraries, and your entire collection.